Hello and welcome. Coming up, when Brexit was so close, why is Boris Johnson taking the risk of throwing everything away in a general election? His Lord Chancellor, Robert Buckland, will tell me. With Labour trailing in the polls, why did Jeremy Corbyn give Boris Johnson his election? Dawn Butler will explain. And Anushka Asthana will, as usual, tell me what they're really saying. And in the one parliament that's never dissolved, Theresa May's former right-hand person, Gavin Barwell, Labour's Melon, the Tories Saeed Avasi and the Lib Dems, Chuka Ramuna. Watcher, Boris Johnson literally had only one important policy, taking us out of the European Union tomorrow night. Well, it ain't gonna happen, and yet, weirdly, no one seems to blame him. WTF, you might say. Instead, Jeremy Corbyn agreed to give Boris Johnson a Christmas present of a general election at the Prime Minister's fourth time of asking. The Lib Dems, Joe Swinson, and the Scottish National Party's Ian Blackford are feeling a bit smug because they said over the weekend they wanted an election and they bounced Jeremy Corbyn into backing one, but at the very last moment, the SNP and the Lib Dems refused to actually vote for Johnson's bill that sets the election date as the 12th of December. So, if that election solves nothing, they'll probably claim it's not their fault. Johnson says he wants the election because he says we need a new parliament to break the Brexit deadlock. But what if after the election MPs still can't decide when, whether or how we should leave the European Union? Yes, another hung parliament could be the nightmare before Christmas that awaits us all. And what may be relevant is that arguably the most talented women Tory ministers of the past few years, Amber Rudd, Justine Greening and tonight Nicky Morgan, have all decided this is the moment to pack it all in. Can you blame them, Anushka?
The experience of being an MP has certainly changed since Brexit divided the country. Now, I want to talk about why Boris Johnson wants an election when, as Robert said, his Brexit deal looks so close to passing. Presumably, it's because he looks at the Tories' average 10-point lead in the polls and thinks he's going to win a majority. Not an unreasonable conclusion in normal times. But Joe Twyman from Delta Poll tells me these are not normal times. And when the Tories look at this electoral map, they have lots of potential reasons to worry. 45 reasons, actually, because that is the number of constituencies that Joe has calculated could be at risk because they are Tory-held, but with a more Remain-leaning electorate and a smaller majority than the Lib Dems managed to overturn in a recent by-election in Brecon in Wales. Now, by-elections can be unusual, but a lot of these seats will be under pressure. Let me give you some examples. Stirling there in Scotland, where the SNP could do well, Cheltenham in West England, where the Lib Dems hope to win, and Chingford in Greater London, where Labour hope a second referendum will appeal. Now, if the Tories lose some of these seats, they need gains just to stand still, never mind to get a majority, and they will be looking at pro-Brexit constituencies for those gains. Now, Joe looked at the 100 most Leave Labour seats and found that if there is a 5% swing from Labour to the Conservatives, the Tories would only win 18 out of that 100, although it does include Great Grimsby, Melanie's seat. If I make that into a 6% swing, there are 8 more, including Halifax, where May launched her manifesto last time. But just to underline how big a swing that is, more than 6% has only happened once in the post-war period, and it was when Blair won that landslide in 1997, remember, there may be very different swings in different suites. For all of this, Joe Twyman is our Geek of the Week. Robert.
Hey, thanks, Anushka. That was enlightening, as always. I'm delighted tonight to be joined by Baroness Warsi, a former chairman of the Tory party. Chuka Ramuna, who's been on this show a few times as a Labour MP, then as an independent MP, and now as a Lib Dem MP, perhaps personifying the extraordinary events of the past couple of years in Parliament. Melon, Labour MP, and Theresa May's very own Downing Street sources, former chief of staff.
Oh, it was all
Lord Barwell, always allegedly better behaved than the current incumbents, as I say, allegedly. I just wanted to start, actually, with the sort of point I mentioned in my introduction. I mean, you know, ever since Boris Johnson announced he was going to be a candidate to be Tory leader and Prime Minister, he literally had only one policy, getting us out on the 31st of October. He's failed. Tomorrow's the 31st of October. We're not leaving. We're not leaving probably till the 31st of January, or if at all, actually. We still don't really know what's going to happen. So why has he sort of sailed through this? Normally you'd expect the most, huge barrels of really horrible stuff to be poured on a party leader and Prime Minister in these circumstances. How's he got away with it, Gavin?
I think he can very clearly say that the reason it hasn't happened is because Parliament won't support him in doing that. I mean, in my own view, when he made that promise, it was never likely to happen because it relied on one of two things.
So he shouldn't have said it.
Well, he relied on either being able to leave with no deal, and there was no evidence that Parliament was going to allow that to happen, or it relied on getting a deal at the European Council and then getting the entire withdrawal agreement bill through in a handful of days. But he's able to say, look, that's what I wanted to do, that's what I tried to do, and I wasn't able to do it because of...
But it's not true, though, is it? Because he could have done it. He had a majority at second reading, and then he decided to mess around over the timetable, try and bounce MPs through.
But that timetable was necessary to get out on the 31st of October.
And if he had just realised that... Actually, he could have still done it before the 31st of October. He just needed to have us sitting on the Friday where we weren't due to sit, and on a Saturday. And
Can I just press you on this? Are you saying that there were enough Labour MPs like yourself who would have been prepared to back a form of Brexit close enough to what the Prime Minister says he wants for him to have been able to accept that?
Well, second reading, he won with a majority of around 30.
But he was terrified that you and your colleagues were going to try and amend his Brexit deal out of all recognition.
Well, as long as... My understanding was as long as it didn't breach the withdrawal agreement that he'd agreed with the EU, that he was prepared to make concessions, and I was ready to roll my sleeves up and meet the commitment that I made to my Grimsby constituents in 2017, that I'd do everything that I could to respect the outcome of the referendum, but do it in a way that protected as much as possible people's jobs and livelihoods.
So, Saida, do you agree with Mel that the Prime Minister was wrong to cut and run? Should he have actually had more of a go at getting this Brexit deal passed?
Well, I mean, if Boris's whole kind of premiership is going to be about Brexit, then I'm not convinced that this election is going to deliver him any more members of Parliament that will vote for this deal, nor will he get this deal any quicker having had this general election. So if for him it was all about getting the numbers and getting the time and getting the speed to get this deal over the line...
There's a completely pointless general election in your view.
I think he was therefore on the right path. We were finally getting to a point within the House of Commons where we were starting to get agreement both behind the deal, and for that whole thing to fail simply because he wasn't happy with the timetable of giving parliamentarians that little bit extra time to be able to ensure that the Withdrawal Act was put into place in a way where it was properly scrutinised. If the answer to that was, well, if I can't do, I'm not prepared to give you an extra 3 or 4 weeks, but hey, let's have an extra few months and have a general election in the middle of Christmas to get there, I'm not convinced how that in the end delivers what I genuinely believe and hope that Boris wants to deliver, which is Brexit.
And just to be clear, I think what you just really said was you don't believe he's going to get a majority.
I'm concerned that this election is not going to turn out in the way that various parties think it's going to turn out.
Including your own.
Including my own. I mean, I looked at the swing that Anushka was talking about. 5% swing puts Wakefield into play. Wakefield is my hometown. I'm not convinced that Wakefield is going to come into play that easily, despite the fact that it voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. You know, people are far more tribal. People have far more considerations at play. This whole kind of sense that there are lots of angry white men out there in the northern seats who are suddenly going to wake up and start voting Conservatives. For somebody who is from Yorkshire and has spent many, many decades campaigning on the doorstep to convince people to vote Conservatives...
You can't see these Labour... allegedly, Boris Johnson needs to persuade 50-year-old, white working-class Labour voters who like Brexit to vote for the Tory party. You think that's an impossible task?
Well, when we started winning seats in 2010 and won even more seats in 2015, and Gavin will remember that, it wasn't just that kind of voter who we attracted to vote for us. We had people voting for us in 2015 in greater numbers than, of course, we had in 2017 because we were a broad church.
Sure.
We are no longer that broad church in the Conservative Party, and I think, therefore, these are high-risk elections.
I just do need to briefly bring in Chuka, and there'll be
I
lots
was
more
just
from
thinking
Chuka.
that the Tory candidate in Wakefield is going to love you tonight. I was just thinking that her rival, or the rival's literature is like former Conservative Party chairman says you haven't got a hope in hell.
But Chuka, but I do need to press you very briefly.
Yeah.
There's lots more to talk with all of you about in a moment or two. But Chuka, I mean, actually, Mel's wrong, isn't she? Because you felt, didn't you, that there were the numbers to attach a confirmatory referendum?
No, I didn't.
You didn't?
Actually, funny enough, I was listening to Mel thinking, actually, I think Mel is right, which is that, look...
So in fact, Boris Johnson bailed you out. You don't want Brexit, and actually, he's given you a lifeline.
Well, our priority as a party is to stop Brexit. And I became convinced, we became convinced that we were not going to get the numbers for a people's vote. You can call it a confirmatory vote or whatever, but you're talking about a people's vote. And we didn't think that there would be the majority in this Parliament for that. And actually, I actually happen to agree with Mel in the sense that I thought the real risk was that that withdrawal agreement would go through and we would be yanked out of the European Union without people having had a final say. So the only other way you can have some kind of democratic process is through an election, and the election of a new parliament that may stop Brexit. And so, in a funny way, I suppose we arrive at the same point. But I think there's a wider point, by the way, here as well, Robert, which is, I think wherever you are on the Brexit argument, our legislature and our government is completely dysfunctional. A government with a majority of -45 and a legislature in chaos. How you can defend
Guess what,
that
Chuka?
carrying
We're
on
going to come back and talk about
beyond me.
all of this. We've got a lot of time to analyse these hugely important questions, but now I'm going to go to Robert Buckland, the Lord Chancellor, and actually I'm going to just start with really rather, I think, a striking statement by one of our distinguished guests. They believe that the Prime Minister is wrong, that actually if he'd persevered for a few more days, he would have got his Brexit deal through.
Well, Robert, I was a veteran of the EU Withdrawal Act of 2018. I can tell you that was a hard slog. Many compromises were made, and the bill that became law was very different from the one that started out. And that was, I think, in more favourable circumstances than the ones we faced in recent weeks. And if that was a hard slog, I think this was going to be a Sisyphean task, to coin a Johnson-esque phrase.
But you're a soft Brexiter. You would have loved it to have been reformed revised so that it was a slightly softer outcome.
Robert, I'm more than happy in crafting compromises and trying to get legislation through. It's one of the things I enjoy most about my work as a parliamentarian. But time was against us. And whatever would have been done with a programme motion, a business of the House resolution, nothing would have been generous enough, I think, for too many colleagues when it comes to the timetable. I think there were too many colleagues who just wanted to deny Boris Johnson the prize of the 31st of October. Frankly, if Parliament is in a mood like that, we need a new one.
OK, but you must accept that the Prime Minister is taking a massive risk in going to the country.
Well, look, elections are always risky. I don't think any of us, me included, who've been involved in many election processes, could sit here with absolute confidence and say what's going to happen. It's going to be a tough fight.
You haven't got a huge majority in Swindon, have you?
I've never had a huge majority, which is why I'm almost slogging my guts out week in, week out in my constituency. But, you know, it's all about now the message and the clarity of the message. We can explain our policy in one sentence. The Labour Party take 2 paragraphs to explain their policy. We have a very clear policy, which is to get Brexit done and then to move on to those domestic priorities on crime and health and education.
But as you say, it is a simple and fairly understandable policy. But in, a Tory seat like Zach Goldsmith's Richmond, it's going to play appallingly. You're going to lose Remain seats, aren't you?
Well, I think it's more complex than that. There are many Remainers, me included, who have accepted the result of the referendum and want to get on and end the uncertainty. And I think, therefore, the message of clarity that we offer is one that's going to resonate with a large portion of the electorate. And therefore, that's why this result is going to be far less clear-cut than merely leave or remain. It's a long campaign. These modern election campaigns of 5 weeks or more mean that a lot of other issues will come to the fore. And it's far from a given that it will just be a purely Brexit-oriented campaign, important though that's going to be.
I mean, one of the fears that many candidates and MPs have is that it's going to be a very ugly campaign. Abuses corrupting our political discourse as never before.
Yeah, it's coarsening the discourse, and it's coarsening it throughout not just Parliament but also on social media as well. And there's no doubt in my mind that too many colleagues have really suffered at the sharp end of that, and it is causing an alarming number of colleagues
And
to
physical
throw it
threats
in.
as well.
Yes, physical threats, some of which have resulted in prosecutions, successful prosecutions, many other cases not brought to court. I've seen for myself the effect on particularly female colleagues who have really borne some appalling, often sexualised language, which frankly in a democracy, in a lively democracy, however robust the debate might be, that crosses the line into something unacceptable and wholly sinister.
Do you think the Prime Minister regrets using that phrase humbug when he was accused of not taking this seriously enough?
I'm sorry about that. I think that there was perhaps a misunderstanding and a look past what that particular Member of Parliament was raising. I'm quite close to that particular issue, the issues that have affected that Member of Parliament. I don't think he would have intended in any way to belittle what has been happening in that case or other cases. He, like all of us, I think, shares that deep concern about the way that discourse has become so rough and cheap. And we owe it to everybody to get the tone of this election right.
I mean, for me, it is really shocking. I mean, I never thought doing this job that I would encounter not just one, but actually a number of MPs, women MPs, actually in tears over the appalling things that are said and threatened. I mean, Mel, do you have a view as to how on earth we can tackle this? Because it is appalling.
Well, I think that there are some lessons in terms of how we choose to respond, in that when you're getting that kind of attack, don't engage, because it just encourages it and it spreads it even further. So there is something that we can do. And I think that, you know, just within Parliament, how we treat each other, how we talk to each other throughout the course of this campaign, you know, how we deal with debate in a mature manner, making sure that our campaigns stay within reasonable guidelines, sets a tone for how people in the general public deal with this.
I mean, some of your colleagues have said that they are anxious about being out alone, knocking on doors in town centres. And that actually they've been advised by the police they need protection.
Well, there will be some of my colleagues who cannot do that. They certainly can't do that alone, and they can't do it without somebody to oversee them, which is that is a terrible indictment of the current political situation, but also very reflective, I think. If you have a referendum and it's a yes-no question, it is divisive. It has divided the country. You know, people have only become more entrenched, and their passions have become quite inflamed over this, and that's why they're feeling the need to scream and shout about it.
Saida, do you hold any of the leaders of our parties responsible for the way that our politics has been degraded? Should they be doing more?
Well, Robert, you may remember that I'm a Brexiteer who in the end voted Remain, and the reason why I felt I couldn't vote for the Brexit campaign despite being deeply Eurosceptic was because the campaign was so toxic, so divisive, and the language that was being used, the basis upon which that campaign was being run, much of it based on lies around migration, around, you know, Turkey joining the European Union, around sexual violence in Cologne, I think at one point was being quoted as part of that campaign. And what I said at that time when I voted Remain was that I could not vote for a campaign which was dividing a country, because that would have real-life consequences on our streets. And we saw, subsequent to the referendum, that we saw the spike in hate crime and aggressive behaviour based around messaging around immigration. So I do feel that, you know, long before we start holding the current leadership of any political party responsible, there is a real responsibility on those who ran that Leave campaign and who actually started and triggered much of what we're seeing now.
So I'm going to come back to you on much of that, but if I could just get back to the Brexit deal for a second, because obviously if Boris Johnson wins the election, he'll bring the deal back. The former Chancellor, Philip Hammond, said of that deal that it's more or less the one that Theresa May negotiated and then rejected because of the border that it brings and puts into the Irish Sea. So this idea that this was some great breakthrough by Boris Johnson is just wrong, isn't it?
No, I don't think that's fair at all. I think that Prime Minister seized the initiative. He made a breakthrough with the Irish government and has struck, I think, a balance that is the right one. You know, Northern Ireland has always been, although it's a strong part of our union, exceptional in many, many respects. And I think that the deal that preserves that balance on the island of Ireland, but also means that they are part of our customs territory, I think is the appropriate way forward here. Now, this is a deal that's supported by the 27. It was a result of a successful renegotiation that we were told was not possible. Many people doubted Boris's intent when it came to securing a deal. He did that, he delivered. And I think now the next step is to get that into domestic law and get us out by the end of January.
I mean, Gavin, we're lucky enough to have you here because you're intimately involved in helping Theresa May negotiate her deal. Is the Chancellor right or is Robert right? Is this essentially the deal that Theresa May negotiated but then rejected because of that border in the Irish Sea?
Look, and the first thing is a large chunk of it is the same on citizens' rights, on the implementation period, on the financial settlement. The key
But on Northern Ireland, on Ireland.
And look, what I would say is it's not identical to what Barnier originally proposed, but it has gone back to a model that is treating Northern Ireland more differently than Theresa's deal did. I'm biased. I don't think it's as good in that regard, but it's proved more effective in getting support in Parliament and ultimately...
So you approve of it?
Well, so I spent 2.5 years trying to tell MPs that I thought that they needed to compromise to find a way out of this divisive situation the country's in. And having done that, it's incumbent on me to compromise and say, this, you know, Theresa's deal is not there anymore. This is the deal on the table. So although I don't think it's as good as the deal she negotiated, if it came to the House of Lords after a general election, then I would reluctantly support it.
Robert, something of a surprise tonight. Perhaps your closest colleague in Cabinet, Nicky Morgan, announcing that she is standing down. Other senior former Tory ministers, Amber Rudd, Justin Greening among them, also leaving Parliament. Why is Nicky going? And how worried are you that the departure of these senior and many would say very able women Tory MPs will change the character of your party and not for the better?
Well, look, I'm personally very sad to see Nicky and other friends going. I've worked with them for years.
What has Nicky said to you about why she's going?
I think the reasons are particularly personal, and I don't think we should go into them. But what I would say is that I'm going to miss her. I'm going to miss Amber and Justine. I've worked with them as colleagues for many years. They're outstanding politicians. But I believe that, you know, with every generation that comes and goes, we will have more people coming in. And, of course, the proportion of women continues to increase in politics.
Are you confident that it will increase in this general election?
Well, I haven't done the psephology, if you like, and looked precisely at where we're going, but I'm encouraged by the numbers of people coming forward and women coming forward into politics now. I feel that you know, none of us has a permanent tenure, if you like, in political life. It's all ephemeral, and of course, with the modern, you know, the modern pace of politics, 1 year feels like 10, and therefore political careers will be much more swift than they perhaps were a generation ago.
And I mean, there are some who say that the Prime Minister is more comfortable working with men like you than women.
Oh, I've not noticed that at all. I think round that cabinet table, there's an equality there. There's a sense of equal opportunity, a sense of joint participation. And I think that Nicky's played a huge part in that. She's been an invaluable member, and we're going to miss her on a personal and a political level.
And finally, there's a report in the FT tonight that the Brexit party, out the goodness of their hearts, may choose to not challenge the Tory party in hundreds of seats in the coming election. Do you want to say thank you to Nigel Farage?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've seen some of these reports. They seem to be a bit conflicting. I think I better leave the machinations of another political party to those responsible for it.
Robert Buckland, lovely to see you. Thanks so much for coming on. We've got more from our amazingly distinguished guests, including Lord Barwell. I think we'll talk to him a bit about this Grenfell report, which has been so gripping to read today. And those of you watching on Twitter will be making our election predictions, believe it or don't. That's a brave thing, on the live stream via @ITV Peston.
Hello, welcome to an unusual Twitter break, sorry, hello, where I've got literally everyone in the studio because we are about to do election predictions. Here we go, one by one. So I've asked everyone to keep in an orderly line here, and one by one I'm going to call you.
Not going to
forward. Robert Buckland, I'm going to call you forward too. What is your prediction? Don't write on my screen. My screen.
My prediction...
For the election.
Right, oh yes, the election. Tory majority of 40.
Tory 40. OK, there you go. Dawn. Dawn Butler, what do you think? Again?
Don't touch the screen. Labour majority, I would say, of 53.
Blimey.
53?
Yeah.
Very
It's very,
That's a lot of gains. Baroness Barcy.
Oh, OK.
You don't think the Tories are going to get that swing I put out, so are you going hung Parliament?
I'm going hung Parliament.
Hung Parliament, and who's the biggest party?
The Tories.
And how far from a majority?
Probably about 3 seats off a majority.
3 seats.
3 seats.
That's not going to solve anything. That's going to put us in purgatory. Lord Barwell.
Ah.
Here we go.
I haven't got a clue, but I'm going to be a little bit more optimistic than Saida, so I'm going to say Tory majority of 10.
Ooh, Tory majority of 10. Does that solve Brexit?
So I think, on Robert's previous formulation, that because the two main parties have both essentially purged themselves, it's unlikely you're not going to get a majority for one or other.
Chucker, I've got to get the last one.
If you don't say 180 majority.
Majority of 400.
Minority government,
Yeah.
which is
Who's biggest?
20. I'm not going to... it's a minority government short of 20.
He won't say who, so he's going in my box of chain.
I'll say that it's a Labour majority, but of only 15.
15. Robert?
Yeah.
OK, you can put down RW.
What does that mean?
Means Robert wrong.
Robert.
Whatever I say is going to be wrong. I'm going in the box of
I'm
chain.
going to say a hung Parliament, and the Tories are going to be 12 short. Thank you!
That is almost
Thanks,
exactly
everyone.
the same as last time.
Welcome back. In just a moment, I'll be talking with the Labour frontbencher, Dawn Butler, but first, Anushka.
Thank you, Robert. I want to talk about the timing of the election and who gains and loses when we go to the polls near Christmas. Check out my advent calendar. Now, there has been lots of talk about cold weather, and according to the political scientist Philip Cowley, there isn't great evidence on this. The last time we had a December election was 1923, before women fully got the vote, so not that easy to pick up lessons. But he has concluded that, on balance, a winter election is probably logistically harder for Labour than the Conservatives because they've got that mass membership. That gives them a ground war advantage, but that should be reduced in part by the weather. And also, are people going to stand out in those rallies waiting for Jeremy Corbyn? There's also a question of students. We know that Labour and the Lib Dems wanted the earlier date of the 9th of December to make sure more are at university, but here's some good news for them, I guess, although this is small overall. The journalist Henry Try pulled this up from gov.uk, showing that in the last 24 hours, 139,000 people have applied to register to vote, and the biggest group by far among them, under 25s and 25 to 34-year-olds. Now, Labour aren't just going to target young people, they also want the Remain vote. And here is how it looks like some of them are going to go after that. A leaflet here from Canterbury, sent to our producer Kish's mum, which says that Labour, if I'm going to find it, will campaign to Remain in a future public vote, which is interesting because that isn't the policy that I've heard them agree to. If we look at the small print on the back, they then clarify that they will campaign to remain against no deal or a bad Tory deal. If I hadn't already given the badge away, Kish's mum would definitely be Geek of the Week for those eagle eyes. Robert.
I think she's always Kish's Geek of the Week, don't you? Thanks so much, Anushka. I'm going to come back to this whole issue of your position on Brexit during the election, but I just want to actually start with why, at the last, Jeremy Corbyn decided to back the general election. I mean, you'll know, because you talk to the same people as I do among your Labour MP colleagues, loads of them think it's a terrible mistake.
But we had criteria that had to be met before we would agree to an election, and that was that there was an extension and that no deal was taken off the table. So both those things were met, and so therefore we're ready to have the election.
Although, as you'll be acutely aware, technically, no deal is still a risk at the end of January. It's also a risk even if Boris Johnson gets his deal through, because, you know, there's a risk that he doesn't get a trade deal and therefore we could drop out without a deal at the end of 2020. So the condition hasn't really been met, has it?
You're right, it's temporary, so it's only till the end of January. That's why this election's so important, because the only way we can get no deal taken off the table indefinitely is to get a Labour government. So that's why we're working so hard to ensure that Labour wins, we get a majority government, and then we will ensure that no deal is taken off the table permanently. And that's the only way to do it. Because it's the only Labour government that we do this, because both sides have decided to go one way or the other. You know, Lib Dems are saying revoke Article 50, the Tories are happy to come out on no deal. The only party that's saying, look, we will give the people the final say is the Labour Party, and we will take no deal off the table is the Labour Party. So ultimately, all roads go to voting Labour.
But what would you say to your colleagues who think that actually, because the opposition is somewhat split in the way that you have just described when it comes to remaining in the EU, you want a referendum, the Lib Dems want to revoke, the Greens also want to remain in the EU, that there is a risk that the opposition vote will split and therefore you will let the Boris Johnson in and get his majority, which is why many of your colleagues have argued to me, and I'm sure to you, that it would have been much, much better to get Brexit settled before an election so that you could then go to the country campaigning on your domestic policies.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It would have been great, but at the end of the day, it hasn't happened. You know, we've had 3 years, we've had 3 different Tory prime ministers. Jeremy's seen them all off, and Parliament is still at an impasse. So the only way to resolve this is to get a Labour government in number 10. So we've got a clear policy, no deal off the table, and the people will have the final say. Whether you voted to leave or remain, the fact is you will get a final say under Labour. You'll get a referendum, you'll get a people's vote, whatever people want to call it, confirmatory vote, you'll get that under a Labour government.
I mean, the official policy you've set out clearly is for a referendum, but it's also ambivalent, neutral between leave and remain. What you've said is you'll make your decision about whether you would campaign to remain or leave after the election. So how is it that in Canterbury they're allowed to put on their leaflets that, you know, your position is for remaining in the EU?
But it's still our policy, and it's absolutely...
Well, that's not your policy, is it? Your policy is that you'll have a referendum. It's not your policy to remain in the EU.
Yeah, but the policy is that on the referendum, people will have a choice. And the
So
choice,
So I want to ask you on that. On your election leaflet, will you make it clear you're in favour of Remain?
Yeah, if you've seen my leaflet, Robert, I'm dressed as the European flag.
Should have come on the European flag. Is that really true? Right. So you are not beating about the bush in terms of how you stand on this.
I don't think anyone will be in any doubt.
That's very funny.
But I do also think that the election will also be more than just Brexit. I mean, you've got to remember this, yeah? The majority of people didn't put Boris in number 10. So he hasn't faced the public vote. And the public are way more intelligent than he gives them credit for. So this is the first time that people are going to have a say about Boris and his buffoonery and all the stuff he gets up to. So I'm really looking forward to coming out there, talking about what a Labour government will look like, talking about our transformative policies, talking about how the country will be different under a Labour government. And I think it's going to be exciting, actually.
So there we've got you in your EU costume. Are you putting on a Union Jack costume, Mel, since you're in favour of leaving the EU?
I probably wouldn't go that far. I don't need to go that far.
But actually, on the more serious point, what will you put on your campaign literature? Will you say that you're in favour of leaving in your campaign
well,
literature?
I'll explain my position. I'll restate the fact that in 2017 I said that I would respect the outcome of the referendum.
And that's still your position, isn't it?
It's still my position. It hasn't changed. It hasn't shifted. I've still
Are you allowed to do that by, Labour HQ?
Well, I mean, we design our own leaflets, as that one certainly shows. And so I'll just be restating my position and what I've done in my constituency. It will go alongside the Labour Party's overall policy, however, so it's not going to be in isolation.
Now, I hope you'll forgive me, Dawn, but we've got to talk giraffes. So you upset quite a lot of people when at the Pink News...
They were not upset at all.
They might have been,
I got a standing ovation for my speech, I have you know.
That I don't doubt. But afterwards, as you know, a number of people had a bit of a go at you for saying that the point about male giraffes is they prove that homosexuality exists in nature. And actually, one or two people said the problem is that male giraffes rather brutalise boy giraffes, and they're not a good example. So do you regret saying what you said?
No, not at all. And the point that I was making is this, that you cannot teach people to be gay. People are who they are, and we should allow people to be their authentic selves and live their lives authentically as they want to be. So that's the point that I was making, and I don't regret making that point at all.
But next time, do you think
you'll
go more into the research into which animals are sort of better performing as adults than others, as it were? Because giraffes apparently are not a great example.
But there are plenty of other examples. There's beetles, there's penguins. You know, homosexuality exists in nature, in the animal kingdom. So, you know, the point is you can't teach people to be gay, and that's the point that I was making. And I stand by that. And I think that this government has done a disservice to the LGBTQI+ community in the delaying of the reform of the Gender Recognition Act. I think they've made it a hostile environment, and I think they should be ashamed of themselves.
Dawn, as always, it's a real joy to have you on the programme. Hope to see you again very soon. I wanted to talk to you, Gavin, if I could, just for a moment or two, because, like me, you probably read the Grenfell report, or part one of the Grenfell report, which I found a deeply harrowing experience, and then obviously watched quite a lot of the debate. Now, there are quite a lot of the families of victims and the survivors who think that the Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade, Danny Cotton, should resign, because the conclusion of the report is that the fire brigade should have abandoned its stay-put instruction to people in the tower considerably earlier. What do you feel about that? Do you think she ought to quit?
I don't think that's an issue for me to express an opinion on. We've had this is the first stage, as you know, of a two-stage report. It's the first stage in giving justice to the people of the families that lost loved ones. You know, if one of them was here, I think they would probably say to you they're looking forward to the second stage, when the actions of ministers like me and civil servants and the local authority and the tenant management organisation are going to be looked into. So I think for me tonight to come on to your programme and call on someone else to resign would not be the right way forward. I think this is a really important report. It begins to explain some of the things that were behind this terrible tragedy. And with respect, I don't want to get into the position of me pointing the finger at other people.
No, I understand that. And there's another issue I want to come back to you about. But I understand that you feel a conflict of interest because, of course, you know, people will be looking at, you know, essentially your policies, as it were, as housing minister, presumably. So I absolutely respect what you're saying. But is there anybody else who feels that actually, you know, in a situation like this, you know, Danny Cotton ought to
I think we
quit?
just need to be a bit careful about knee-jerk reactions. You know, when we're talking about heightened politicisation in the environment at the moment, I think we need to be really careful about that. I recognise that people want justice for what happened there. This is the first stage of the report. It's very easy, I think, to point at one person at this stage. but I suspect that some of the issues are much more deep and broader.
No, I mean, look, obviously the report goes into enormous detail about failures of communication between the 999 call centre and the...
You're not going to get justice saying it was a failure of a system, because that's not anybody to point the finger at, which is the challenge.
So there is a particular sentence in the report which I think is hugely important, where he says that although they're going to go on and look at the building regulations and some of those issues in the second stage, there is already clear evidence that the material that was on the exterior of that building did not comply with the building regulations. And actually, absent that report, there's evidence that lots of other buildings in our country have material.
This is something I want to pick up on, because when you read the description of how the material melted, how it spread through the building, it is shocking and, as I say, deeply harrowing. Now, the other salient fact is there are still apparently 60,000 odd British people living in buildings clad in this way. Why hasn't the cladding been removed from these buildings yet?
Because the way that the whole attitude of the system to social housing generally in this country is to treat those who live in it like second-class citizens at all levels. And I don't just think it's a systemic thing, it's a cultural thing in terms of the way that people are treated. And that's why, actually, I think the second stage of the report will be very interesting. And I think it's not just a systemic thing. There's a whole change in mindset and how people are treated. They're not treated like individuals, they are treated just like a number.
And then, Gavin, but then we're going to have to go to the break. But Saida?
I was a commissioner, Robert, on the Shelter Commission on the Future of Social Housing, which was launched earlier this year alongside Ed Miliband and actually others who were victims themselves by losing loved ones in the Grenfell fire. And what Chucker is saying is absolutely right. We need to have a national conversation and a complete rethink as to how we provide social housing. And if that means, and as we recommended in the Shelter Commission report, a major social house building exercise across the country, if we look at the lack of social housing, not just for people, young families, but for elderly people, for people who are going to have those properties adopted for use as they get older.
Can I just bring Gavin in?
So I don't disagree with the word Chucker said, and actually Theresa spoke really powerfully about that, I thought, in the House. But actually, councils and housing associations have done a good job at starting to remove this cladding. The problem is private sector, and even now the government has offered to pay for it.
The
government's offered to pay for it, and it's still not happening quickly enough, and we've got to get on top of it.
We've got to get on top of it. So much more to talk about after the break. Grenfell and general elections. Don't go away.
What am I on? Oh, hi. Welcome to the break. I have all our friends once again, and we're going to play a little game this time, which is talking about MPs who we are going to lose from Parliament. And you can pick out on each of our categories. Number one, sorry to see you go.
Oh.
Who are you sorry to see go? Who are you sorry to see go, Gavin?
Oh, can I just...
Oh, Gloria De Piero from Mel.
She's lovely.
So this is like my...
Ken Clark. Oh, look. Saida Martin's put a heart. Vince Cable. Gavin. Oh, Amber Rudd.
And I will just cross party lines and say hi because she was a 2015 intake with me.
So is Parliament going to be weaker without them?
Pleased to see the back of you. Oh,
what about this one?
Well, I don't know.
We focus on the famous names, and there are some new people that have come fairly recently that are leaving.
Let me just do this again quickly. Come on. Right, here we go. Pleased to see the back of you. Oh, it's not working. Just tell me, who are you pleased to see the back of?
I don't want to really. I'm not.
Come on.
I'm not going to go down
I'm not going to
that
go
avenue.
down that road.
John Bercow, Gavin, did you find him a bit difficult?
So I think John did some fantastic things for Parliament. I think there's also some concerns I would have about him. But on balance, I think he was a change.
All right.
And I'll say...
Kate Hoey, not a very good neighbour sometimes, Chucker?
I have massive differences with her on Europe, but I wouldn't go as far to say that I'm
I'll
glad
say
to see the back of her.
Amber, because it's such a small majority that she had in Hastings that it does, it'll be a change seat, so it'll be...
OK, and we're not even going to get onto banter,
change
sorry.
seat.
That's it.
Hey!
Time up, but thank you all very much. Cheers.
Welcome back to the programme. Here's Anushka.
Thank you, Robert. You started the show by talking about some of the high-profile MPs stepping down, including Amber Rudd and the Culture Secretary, Nicky Morgan. I want to talk about them. Here is Nicky's tweet saying she's not going to stand for the first time in 18 years. In the letter, she mentions the impact on her family, but also the abuse she's faced. And let's just look at how many others are going. Gavin Freegard at the Institute for Government has totted it up, and there are 58 standing down, including 26 Tories and 18 Labour MPs, including Owen Smith, who stood for the leadership just 3 years ago. Some going because of the shifting nature of their parties, but others, and particularly women, citing abuse. Now, I just want to show you something that Gavin Barwell's predecessor, as Theresa May's Chief of Staff, has written in tomorrow's Spectator. Nick Timothy hasn't been very kind about his old boss. He says Boris is a born campaigner, whereas Theresa May wilted under pressure. Boris has ended austerity. Theresa refused to change fiscal policy. A bit harsh when you consider he wrote the manifesto. And he goes on to say that when May was confronted by European intransigence, she folded faster than a Brompton bicycle. I'd like to see how quickly Nick Timothy could fold one of them up. Robert.
Actually, the world is divided between those who can fold these bicycles faster and those who can't. But let's not argue about that. Look, Gavin, you worked with Theresa May for a good couple of years. What do you make of Nick Timothy's criticism, in particular one that she was just too soft in negotiations with the EU?
So I don't think that's borne out at all. The EU, actually, as I said earlier to you, wanted a model that treated Northern Ireland differently, and after a huge row, she managed to get them off that position. You know, I could go through 4 or 5 other key things that we got in the negotiations. So I don't think that stands up to scrutiny. I think there's a wider point that if somebody appoints you as her Chief of Staff and gives you that huge opportunity, I don't think it shows a great deal of loyalty afterwards to make those kinds of comments personally, but that maybe I have a different approach to these things.
And I notice that Anthony Selden has just published a book about Theresa May, which is pretty unflattering to her. When time has passed and we've got a bit more distance, how do you think people will see her period in office?
So I think the first thing to say about, in terms of the election, she herself, as she was sitting here, regrets very much the way she ran that campaign, and it made her job much more difficult. But I think most people, and this was my experience when I was doing the job, think this is someone who believed in public service, who worked incredibly hard to try and find a compromise. She wasn't able to do it. She's got to live with that, and so do I. But I think her motivation for being in politics was a very good one. And I think it's greatly to her credit that she's not now going to go off and do something else. She wants to stay as a constituency MP and stay in Parliament. I think that's good for Parliament when we've got so many other people leaving. So
She never, don't you think, she never really took on the right of the party. And if there's anything her predecessors had learned, was that you can keep chucking as much meat as you want to the right-wing nationalists in your party. It was never going to be enough. And until she was prepared to take them on, which she was never prepared to do, she was going to have trouble all the way throughout. And in the end, they killed her off.
So I think it's a little bit harsh, given that the deal that she tried to sell was one that those people in the party didn't approve of. That's why ultimately she lost her job, because she was trying to sell a compromise. And what I would say is the problem she had is that there were some people on the ERG, for example, who wanted a harder Brexit and thought if they hung on they could get that. And there were others like yourself who wanted a second referendum and thought if they didn't compromise, they could get that. One of those two groups of people at the end of this process is going to have miscalculated.
But she
and we'll
had-
find out after the election.
And whether you agree with, whether you're for Theresa or against Theresa, the one thing that we all have to accept is that the deal that we now have on the table was predominantly negotiated by her. She did the hard graft, and that she may not have led the party in a chairman-like way in the way that Boris does, but she was a very good chief executive. She did the details, she did the nitty-gritty hard work, and she actually did the tough negotiations upon which Boris then built.
I mean, can I ask a question? Because we're about to say goodbye to this very strange period in Parliament's history. I'm struggling to think of a single thing that it really achieved.
Net zero. Net zero. I would argue one of the biggest decisions she actually took after she'd announced she was standing down, which is to make the commitment that we're going to move to net zero emissions. That's a
by
huge...
By 2050, yeah.
Yes, it's a long-term decision, but
I
it's a
think
huge
it's
one.
illustrated.
But can I just ask you, is
Go on.
this Gavin right that is a significant achievement?
I'm not sure in terms of greening the economy, Theresa May government achieved the whole load. But I'll tell you one thing this Parliament has illustrated is that the first past the post system is completely past itself by day.
So says the Lib Dem.
Every minor party has said that.
It has
since the
not
beginning.
delivered stable government, which was the primary
It's certainly
argument
true that we haven't
for
had stable government with first past the post for a hell of a long
stable
time. But I think, and there is a serious point there.
referendum.
Because listen, I've spoken to a number of
broken.
Tories who think that first past the post has had its day. Actually, interestingly, I mean, what do the rest of you think?
No, I mean, I do think it tends to be the calls from the smaller parties that would get a greater
I was making that
representation.
argument when I was
Let's see how you feel about this after this election.
Yeah, well, maybe, but I think, it also opens up the door to other fringe parties that we might not be as happy to sit alongside.
But listen,
as tough as
apart from
party.
net zero, come on, somebody tell me that we haven't all wasted the last 2.5 years.
Yeah,
What
I mean,
else is...
it's not positive, and it's probably not a good thing
It's
to
an
end on.
understatement.
But I think that other than Brexit, I think what this last Parliament will be remembered for, sadly, will be the deep-rooted racism in political parties. I think the row around anti-Semitism and the row around Islamophobia within the Conservative Party has trundled through for the last 3 years now. And I hope, and I sincerely hope, and I've already started saying this, that I sincerely hope that
open a new chapter.
Yeah, that we open a new chapter, and we do that on the first day of the election by basically saying that I hope this election will not be about Labour Party's anti-Semitism and the Conservative Party's Islamophobia, however strongly I feel about it, because I think if that's the basis of the election, we will end up with a far more divided nation.
I don't think anyone can say to you that this Parliament has been a triumph, but actually there are lots of good things underneath the surface that we've got house building up to a better level. We're putting more money into our NHS.
Nobody believes any of that. It's just not working. People are not feeling those benefits.
Well, so there's
They
certainly
are
more,
not
there's
feeling
more
those
to do on both
benefits.
those things, but it is a fact that house building...
I think we're getting a taste of the general election, which is literally days away. That's all we've got time for. We're about to start that general election campaign. Well, it started here already. As the race starts, join us next week to know who, if anyone, is inching ahead or not. Bye.